Welcome to the Jamesport Christian Broadcast Network podcast, JCBN.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to JCBN, the Jamesport Christian Broadcast Network. Michael Trusty here, your host for the Not One Stone podcast. Welcome today. If you're joining us for another episode, no, I did not say that that they rolled a wheelbarrow up to the cross and pulled out thousands of pages of the old law or the tablets and nailed them up to the cross physically. No, that didn't happen. Now, the futures might want you to believe that because they take everything literally, and they believe that the old law was nailed to the cross. And I'm here to tell you today that I do not believe that anymore. I don't believe that the law passed at the cross. I believe it passed when Jesus came on the cloud and Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. In fact, I know that's the truth. I mean, there's no way that you're going to ever get me to believe again that the old law was nailed to the cross and 50 days later came the new law, 3,000 were saved. Let me see if I can imagine. Cross and 50 days with no law. Nobody had a law for 50 days. Are you sure about that? Are you serious that the old law was nailed to the cross and the new law didn't come for 50 days and there was a 50-day blank space in there where nobody was under God's law? Because what law would you be under? Come on, Mr. Futures, answer that question. You have to answer that question because, look, you're going to have to come to the same conclusion that the truth brings us to, that both covenants existed together, and they ended, or the old law ended in AD 70 at the fall of Jerusalem. And I know everyone agrees that the new covenant didn't have its beginning until the first Pentecost after the resurrection of Christ at the destruction there of Jerusalem in AD 70. So if the old covenant didn't pass away until the destruction of Jerusalem, like I'm telling you it didn't, then after Pentecost, two covenants were in operation at the same time. That's what happened. No one was under, actually, although no one was under both of them at the same time. Well, you have to understand that. Gentiles were never under the law of Moses. They never died to that law, nor were they ever discharged from the law, according to Romans chapter number 7. Now, the Jews who had become Christians on Pentecost and afterward did die to that old law, and they were discharged from it, we know. And of course, Christians, Jews, as they were there in Jerusalem and the cities there and all, and with all the big walls surrounding it there, didn't travel on the Sabbath. Well, why didn't they do that, Mike? Because their city gates were closed. They couldn't travel there. So, and they also circumcised their male children. That's a practice that they continued doing on and on. So we see that, but we know that the law, whole law of Moses, wasn't nailed to the cross, okay? We know what we studied last time, Matthew chapter 5, the verses 17 through 18, where Jesus said, "Think not that I come to destroy the law or the prophets. I didn't come to destroy, but I came to fulfill," he said. "For verily I say unto you," what? Until, now you get that word right, until heaven and earth, Jerusalem and all the old stuff, the old law there, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot, one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law until all things be fulfilled. So in that passage there, did Jesus teach that none of the law or the prophets would pass away until all of them were fulfilled? Well, did he teach all of the law and the prophets are going to pass away when only some of them were fulfilled? I seen somebody on one of John's programs last night. Well, they weren't all fulfilled. Or did he teach that none of the law or the prophets would pass away until all of them were fulfilled? Well, that's what he taught, didn't he? Then Jesus taught the same thing over in the Sermon on the Mount, as he did in Revelation chapter 10 and the verse 7. There Jesus taught that the destruction of Jerusalem would occur, what? When the seventh trumpet, that is the last trumpet, sounded. So if the law and the prophets taught that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, like John was talking about the other night, during the days of the Roman Empire, at that time it was going to take place. So the martyrs in that destruction had to take place before one jot or tittle of the law passed away. And I noticed some of the guys coming on there, and some of these futures come on there and they argue with you, and they want to go back and what about this? What about that verse? What about that? And they don't understand who they're arguing with. That's the problem, because most of all of us that are in the preterist camp today were futurists for many, many years, probably hundreds of years combined. So they're not saying anything when they're blabbling all this stuff out there on the internet, on Facebook, or some of the comments that they're making on some of these sites about this. Look, let me say this to you right now. Not trying to belittle you or anything, but most of the preachers that are preterists now that were futurists in the futurist camp, especially in the Church of Christ, they know what you're going to say before you say it, because we fought it. We were there. We talked all that stuff you're talking now. We worked with others on that. We debated others on that. We taught others that. So there's really not anything you're saying that we don't understand, that we didn't know what you're going to say, or that we didn't say ourselves. So we need to understand that. Listen, in Daniel chapter 9, over 9 through 12 there, the law was spoken of as being in a process, and we get back to the lesson here, being in a process of passing away. Okay, we heard about it, a process of passing, of fading away. Didn't I talk about that one time? I talked about fade. You know how you fade away? You know, I was watching a Clint Eastwood movie the other night. I don't know which one it was, but he was riding on a horse, and he went out into the desert, and you know, all the sun reflection in the desert, and that horse just finally disappeared. He was fading into it and passing. You know, they want to make you think that it went boom and it's there and it's got to be there, but no, it passed away. And we know that the law was spoken of as being a process of passing away in a present tense, of course, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 11. And listen, that was written 30 years after the cross. So how can you nail all the law to the cross there? And it was still passing 30 years after the cross. It wasn't complete. It was still passing there. 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and the verse 11. Open your eyes there. Jewish Christians, including Paul, guys, was still keeping that law in Acts chapter 21, the verses 17 through 21. He's still keeping it. 27 years after the cross, Paul was still keeping it. So it was fading. It was in the process of going away. It was going to go away in AD 70. It didn't go just bam at the cross and it was nailed to the cross and done away with. If that was the case, again, it was still in operation 30 years after the cross. 2 Corinthians, it was still operation 27 years after the cross. Acts chapter 21. So the author of Hebrews says it's what? It's still in operation, but nigh unto vanishing away. Do you know what vanishing away means? Tell me what vanishing away is. Yeah, leave it in the comments. Tell me what it means. I know what it means. Hebrews chapter 8 and the verse 4. Hebrews chapter 8 and the verse 13. 37 years, guys. 37 years after the cross, it was still fading away. It wasn't nailed to the cross. We're going to find out what that probably was. It was nailed to the cross, but it wasn't the whole law of Moses. Well, I can see it through study here, and some people ought to be able to see it. You see, in truth, the Mosaic law didn't pass away until all of it was fulfilled. When Jerusalem, we studied this the other night, until Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed with its altars, its genealogical tablets, its priesthood, and all of its system, when it passed away. You know, somebody said something the other day to me, wars and rumors of war. Yeah, not like this war. Not like this one. Not this one. This one destroyed the temple. This one destroyed the old heaven. This one destroyed the old earth. It's gone. AD 70. It's gone. And it was fading. They existed together. And then it vanished away in AD 70. So, and along with it, its priesthood, the genealogical tablets, the altars, everything they had there. So that everything's gone there. That would what? Make obedience to the temple services impossible. And it's still true to this day. It's impossible to this day. Well, what about other teachings of a 40-year transition of covenants? Hebrews chapter 8, 7. Hebrews chapter 8, 13, and 7. Or Hebrews chapter 13 to the verse 7. I believe for if the first covenant had been faultless, then would no place have been sought for a second? And the verse 13, in that he saith, a new covenant he hath made the first old. But that which is becoming old and waxeth age is nigh unto vanishing away. Notice in verse 13, the present tense use of the old covenant. It's becoming old. Let me say that for you futurists. It's becoming old. It's waxing age and nigh unto vanishing away. Can you not see that? The verse 13. It's obvious. It's obvious, guys, that 30 years after the cross, the law of Moses hadn't passed away yet. Yeah, there wasn't no 50 years of no law. It hadn't passed away 30 years after, if you study it there. From Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 5 there, in the sermon there, verses 17 and 18, it's obvious why it hadn't. It hadn't all been fulfilled until, actually in 8060s, Hebrews was written, okay? It was still becoming obsolete, according to Hebrews, and was going to vanish away soon. When what? When all was fulfilled. When the old heaven, the old earth passed away, and the new heaven and the new earth came in, that was going to be fulfilled. But listen, the covenants were still in transition. They just didn't stop one day. They're still in transition. And there was a transition to those covenants. So that's something that we need to understand. They were still in transition here. To see when it was all fulfilled, we have to notice what Jesus said it would all be fulfilled. Luke 21, 20 through 22. Again, Luke 21, 20 through 22 and 20. But he says what? When you see, John said it the other night, when you see Jerusalem's encompassed with armies, then you can know, we talked about being encompassed. That's an army term for being surrounded. You're fixing to be doomed. And when you see that happening, then you know that desolation is at hand. And then he says, then let them that are in the Judea flee into the mountains, and let those that are in the midst of her depart out, and let not them that are in the country enter therein. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. And in the verse 32, Jesus specified when those events would occur. He said what? He's saying, hey, look here, I'm saying to you, this generation that's standing right here in front of me will not pass away until all these things be fulfilled. Can y'all not see that? Hebrews 9, 6 through 10, the author of Hebrews in the section is discussing the first tabernacle in the Old Covenant, which in the 8060s was still in operation. It was still going. It wasn't nailed to the cross. It was still going. Okay? And the verse 6 says there, now these things having been thus prepared, the priests go in continually into the first tabernacle, accomplishing the services. And the verse 7 says, but into the second, the high priest alone, once in the year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors of the people. And the verse 8 says, and the Holy Spirit, this signifying that the way into the holy place had not yet been made manifest, while the first tabernacle was still yet standing. In the verse 9, which is a figure for the time present, according to which are offered. That's the present tense. Both gifts and sacrifices that cannot, as touching the conscience, make the worshiper perfect. In the verse 10, being what? Here's the present tense. Being only with meats and drinks and divers washings, carnal ordinances imposed until a time of reformation. So when the author of Hebrews claims, that the old covenant tabernacle was a figure for when? The time, that present time then, Okay? He's not speaking of our time, today, 2,000 years later. He's talking about present at that time. Okay? He wasn't speaking of 2,000 years later. You're not going to be able to put something in front of me anymore to tell me that's what he's talking about. He's not. He's talking about his own time, their own time, the first century time, that generation in which Jesus lived in that time. That's obvious. So it's obvious to me as I'm studying that the Mosaic covenant was still in operation 30 years after the cross. 30 years. At the time of Reformation, when the temple and its sacrificial system would be leaving, it would be going away, that system would no longer be imposed. As Jesus says, what? Her desolation is at hand. Okay? I hope you can see that. Very easy to see, but you got to open your mind and look at it. Hebrews 10:9-10, we talk about that a lot. And he said, Lo, I am come to do thy will. He taketh away the first, that he may establish the second. Verse 10, by which we will have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Christ once and for all. So, newsflash, when the author of Hebrews says that Jesus was taking away the first covenant in his time, it's obvious it hadn't already come. It hadn't already been nailed to the cross, taken to the cross. There was a 40-year transition from the old covenant to the new covenant in the first century. Remember shadows, types, antitypes. What happened in the Old Testament when they were slaves in Egypt, brought out, crossed over the Red Sea. There's a crossing there. 50 days after that, they received the law of Moses, right? 3,000 died. Then what happened? They wandered there. How many years? And then came into the promised land. Then they were in spiritual bondage, right? And then Christ came. Here's the type and the antitype. Christ came. He died on the cross. Then 50 days after that, the new law came. 3,000 didn't die. 3,000 were saved then. And then it come to Jerusalem when it fell in AD 70. There's the other end of that. And then heaven was opened up. It's simple. It's plain as the nose on your face. I couldn't believe that I was turned and sent here and there and if and ands and maybes about all that stuff that came from Catholicism into our Bibles and our theology. Wow. 2 Corinthians, guys, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, the verses 6 and 11, and another passage, they compare the two covenants, okay? Listen to this, 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 7, Paul says, But if the ministration of death written and engraved on stones came with glory, so that the children of Israel could not look steadfastly upon the face of Moses for the glory of his face, which glory was passing away. In verse 8, And how shall not rather the ministration of the Spirit be with glory? Verse 9, For if the ministration of condemnation hath, this present tense, glory, much rather doth the ministration of righteousness exceed in glory. Verse 10, For verily that which has been made glorious hath not been made glorious in this respect, by reason of the glory that surpasseth. Verse 11, For if that which passeth, that's present tense, he's talking in present tense, For if that which passes away was with glory, much more that which remaineth is in glory. Obviously, again, the first covenant, the law of Moses, was passing away, as Paul wrote there in 2 Corinthians, in what? Let's see, 50s AD. 50s AD. It hadn't passed away at the cross. It wasn't nailed to the cross a quarter of a century before. In Colossians 2, verses 13 through 17, one last passage showing that the old covenant hadn't passed away by 62 AD. Is the statement made in Colossians chapter 2, the verses 13 through 17. The very passage commonly used to teach the old covenant was, big old law was nailed to the cross. Verse 13, And you being dead through your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, you, I say, did he make alive together with him, having forgiven us all our trespasses, having blotted, remember that, blotted. Oh, remember that. Blotted out the bond, remember that. Written in ordinances, remember that word, ordinances, that was against us, them, which was contrary to them, and he taketh away it out of the way, nailing him to the cross, having despoiled the principalities and the powers, he made a show of them, openly triumphing over them in it. Let no man therefore judge you in meat or drink, or in respect of a feast day, or a new moon, or a Sabbath day. In verse 17, which are shadow of the things to come. But the body is Christ, something that was nailed to the cross. We're about to see what it was. About to see what it was. But over 30 years later, Paul says that the regulations of the old covenant concerning what? Meats, the drinks, feast days, the new moons, the Sabbath, and that was in his time, the present tense, still functioning as shadows of the things to come when in the new heaven and the new earth and the new covenant. The old covenant hasn't passed away, guys. It hadn't passed away yet. Again, Paul obviously agrees with Jesus that the old covenant wasn't going to pass away until it had all been fulfilled. If the law of Moses didn't pass away at the cross, that whole law was taken up there and all that law nailed to the cross, and they didn't have a law for 50 days. If that was the truth, what was nailed to the cross? In Colossians chapter 2 and the verse 14. Remember Colossians 2 and 14, having blotted out the bond, remember the words I said, having blotted out the bond written in ordinances that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he hath taken it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Paul didn't say in whatever that law of Moses was nailed to the cross. That's not what he said. What is the bond written in ordinances that was against them? He says the bond written in ordinances against us. Well, Strong says it's choregraphon is the word, neuter of a compound there, something in a handwriting and a manuscript, and we see in the Greek and the New Testament there, it's a legal document. A legal document, something that's nailed there. A legal term, I guess, would be maybe something that was presented a persecutor in a courtroom. Contracts, a technical word in the Greek there. There's just a lot of parallels there. An interesting parallel here that one of the authors said is the writ of charges Pilate had installed on the cross of Jesus. And it's the same word used here. The New King James Study Bible has the following note there about John 19:19. It was a Roman custom to write the name of the condemned person and his crime on a plaque to be placed above his head at the execution. Mark calls this title the inscription of his accusation. You can see Mark 15 and 26. So that legal bond, this was just something they did then. That they practiced there, and Syrians use the word sinner and debtor interchangeably. But let's understand that this was an ordinance. It was a legal document against them in those days of certain things. Notice how David refers to blotting out and uses the same language in Psalms 51, verses 1 and 9. He says, have mercy on me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according to the multitude of thy tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions. Hide thy face from my sins. Blot out all mine iniquities. And Jeremiah 18 and 23, the same type of language, uses that same word language, says there, yet Jehovah, thou knowest all their counsel against me to slay me. Forgive not their iniquity, neither blot out their sin from thy sight. But let them be overthrown before thee. Deal thou with them in the time of thine anger. So in both of these passages there, David and Jeremiah prayed that God would blot out, there's just the same language here, blot out the sin. Not the law. Not the law. You see, if it's saying this same, how can I put this maybe in a way you could see it? Okay, if I come to your town, let's say, and I'm driving out on the highway, and the highway comes from a 60 speed limit to a 40 speed limit. And let's say the 40 mile an hour speed limit sign blew down, and I'm from thousands of miles away, and I drive through at 60. And the police stops me, and he gives me a ticket. He gives me this ordinance. He gives me a ticket. And I go to the court, and I say, I beg you to forgive me of this. Your Honor, I'm from 1,000 miles away. I don't know why your sign was blown down. I guess the recent storm. Could you please forgive me of this? Could you blot this out for me? Cross it out, X it out, blot it out. Could you do that for me, Your Honor? And Your Honor says, okay, I'll blot that out. Well, let me ask you a question. He's not talking about canceling the whole law of the land or the law of your area. It's still in effect. Your law is still in effect. You just blot it out. My offense there, because of stupidity or whatever it was, he blotted that out. And so, when you go to studying that and you see it, you're going to see that over 25 translations say it that way. They say it the way it was, not the way the Bible's been handed down to you from Catholicism. Listen to these 25 examples. New American Standard says, having concealed out of the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, and which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. All right, the New Jerusalem Bible says, he has wiped out the record of our debt to the law which stood against us. He's destroyed it by nailing it to the cross. The Revised Standard Version has the same saying, or the New Jerusalem Bible says, he has wiped out the record of our debt to the law which stood against us. He has destroyed it by nailing it to the cross. The New Revised Standard, and when you were dead in your trespasses and uncircumcision of your flesh, God made you alive together with him when he forgave us all our trespasses, erasing the record that stood against us with its legal demands. He set it aside, nailing it to the cross. English Standard Version, and you who were dead in your trespasses and in the uncircumcision of your flesh, God made alive together with him, having forgiven us our trespasses by canceling the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. J.B. Phillips' translation says, you who are spiritually dead because of your sins and your uncircumcision, i.e. the fact that you were outside the law, God is now made to share the very life of Christ. He has forgiven you of your sins. Christ has utterly wiped out the damning evidence of broken laws and commandments which always hung over our heads, and has completely annulled it by nailing it over his own head on the cross. The New International Version says, having canceled the charges of our legal indebtedness which stood against us and condemned us, he has taken it away, nailing it to the cross. New Living Translation says, he canceled the record of our charges against us and took it away by nailing it to the cross. How about the Berean Study Bible? It says, having concealed the debt ascribed to us and the decrees that stood against us, he took it away, nailing it to the cross. How about the Holman Christian Standard Bible? It said, he erased the certificate of debt with its obligations that was against us and opposed to us, and has taken it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. How about the International Standard Version? It says, having erased the charges that were brought against us, along with their obligations that were hostile to us, he took those charges away when he nailed them to the cross. How about the Aramaic Bible? Plain English says, and he has blotted out by his authority the bill of our debts, which was adverse to us, and he took it from the midst by nailing it to the cross. How about the Jubilee Bible 2000? Says, blotting out the bill of the decrees that was against us, which was contrary to us, and took it out of our way, nailing it to the cross. How about the Common English Bible? He destroyed the record of the debt we owed with its requirements as worked against us. He concealed it by nailing it to the cross. The Complete Jewish Bible says, he wiped away the bill of charges against us because of the regulations. It stood as a testimony against us, but he removed it by nailing it to the execution stake. How about the Good News Translation? He canceled the unfavorable record of our debts with its binding rules and did away with it completely by nailing it to the cross. How about the Lexingham English Bible? Having destroyed the certificate of indebtedness and ordinances against us, which was hostile to us, and removed it out of the way by nailing it to the cross. How about the Message Bible? The slate wiped clean, that old arrest warrant, canceled and nailed to the cross. The New Century Version, he canceled the debt, which listed all the rules we failed to follow, he took away that record with its rules and nailed it to the cross. The New Living Translation, guys, he canceled the record of the charges against us and took it away by nailing it to the cross. I could go on. You want me to go on? He blotted it out. He X'd it out. He X'd it out that which was against him. Not the whole law of Moses. No, the law was still in effect. The law carried on, guys. He didn't just take it up there and blot that out with a little X. That was the law. It was still in effect. Remember, caught me speeding. That didn't cancel out the whole law. People still had to do 40 miles per hour through there. I just got it canceled on me because I was ignorant at that time. So I think you get the gist there. The law of Moses, the whole law of Moses, guys, was not nailed to the cross, contrary to Catholic beliefs, and then passed on down to some of your grandmothers. As Jesus taught, it passed away when it was all fulfilled. Matthew 5:17 and 18 through our last class there. And in his generation, Luke 21:20 through 22. Ooh, how much more proof do you need? Go study that. Go study it. Look, I'm not laughing at anybody. I sit here and think of how ignorant I was trying to teach and debate and twist and turn scriptures back over when I was over in the futurist part of that stuff, and how ignorant I was. How ignorant I was, and how I see all these people today that want to throw this future stuff at you like it's something new to you. And, you know, you're asking them to study with you, and you're saying, here's a verse, there's a verse, study with me. They're going like, no, what about this? What about that? Well, what about this that you're giving me? I've already debated that. I've already looked at that. I was part of that. That system's what I came out of. I came into the truth out of that stuff. Quit throwing that stuff out. We already know it. Come study with us. Learn the truth. Understand it. I pray, God, that you will, because that's up to you. That's between you and God. Now that you hear the truth, you need to go look at it. If you don't want to look at it, that's not up to me. I'm just planting. And watering, God gives the increase. May God bless you in your studies. Thank you for your time today, and I hope to see you here next time on the Not One Stone podcast here on JCBN, Jamesport Christian Broadcast Network. You can write us a question if you'd like. Go over to gojcbn.com, www.gojcbn.com. See you next time.